Ever since Russian forces rolled across Ukraine's borders in February 2022, Western officials, media outlets, and think tanks have been almost unanimous in their predictions. Russia's economy was about to collapse. The sanctions announced in those first months were described as unprecedented, a financial nuclear bomb that would reduce Moscow to ruin. Then U.S. President Joe Biden declared with confidence in March 2022 that the ruble had been reduced to rubble and that the Russian economy was on track to be cut in half. It was a bold statement, the sort of line that was supposed to cement the narrative of Russian weakness, but the reality didn't play out as expected. Within weeks, the ruble had bounced back, regaining its pre-war levels and later strengthening further. By 2025, it had become one of the world's strongest performing currencies, and when measured in purchasing power parity, Russia's GDP had climbed to become the fourth largest in the world. Instead of collapsing, the Russian economy adapted, restructured, and kept functioning despite the weight of sanctions and global pressure. But now, more than 3 years into this war, the mood has shifted again. By mid-2025, the chorus of voices claiming that Russia is on the edge of an economic cliff has grown loud once more. This time, the warnings aren't just coming from Western leaders or analysts, but from within Russia itself, from some of the country's own top officials who admit that the economic model that carried them through the first stages of the war is running out of steam. The question is whether Ukraine and its backers are finally succeeding in pushing Russia toward economic collapse, or whether the opposite is true, and it's Ukraine that is at greater risk of exhaustion. Almost no one seriously believes anymore that Ukraine can win this war outright on the battlefield. The optimism of 2022 and 2023 has faded. The front lines today are defined by trench warfare, artillery duels, and a grinding war of attrition. Both sides focus less on sweeping territorial gains and more on destroying as much of the other, as manpower and equipment as possible. In such a war, the balance naturally tilts toward the side with greater resources, more soldiers, more weapons, more factories, and more money. Despite the huge losses Russia has taken, its sheer numerical advantage remains overwhelming in nearly every respect. It has more troops, larger reserves of weaponry, and vastly greater industrial capacity. Because of this, since early 2024, the front line has been inching steadily westward, with the pace of Russian advances slowly accelerating. Yet the battlefield is only one dimension of this wider conflict. Alongside the trenches and artillery barrages, 2 other wars are being fought, wars that may prove just as decisive. The first of these is the long-range campaign of missile and drone strikes, where both Russia and Ukraine launch attacks deep behind enemy lines. These strikes target not only military depots and logistics hubs, but also economic infrastructure, power plants, refineries, transportation routes, and factories. Ukraine, in particular, has shown ingenuity in using long-range drones to hit Russian refineries and depots, causing significant financial damage while also straining domestic supplies of fuel. And then there is the third front, the economic war. This front has always been central to the broader Western strategy, a test of endurance in which the side with deeper financial resources can ultimately outlast the other. Here, Russia's strengths are obvious. It possesses vast natural resources, energy revenues, and financial reserves. But Ukraine has something Russia lacks: powerful patrons with the ability to pour in money, weapons, and political support. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and others have supplied Ukraine with over 16,000 sanctions targeting Russia, and with direct financial assistance on a scale never seen before. In a war of attrition fought in the economic sphere, Ukraine and its allies appear to have the larger purse. When all 3 of these fronts, the battlefield, the long-range strikes, and the economic struggle, are viewed together, the picture becomes far more complex. Russia dominates the military ground game, but Ukraine and its partners have scored successes on the financial and infrastructure fronts. The stakes are immense. If Russia's economy begins to falter and it loses the ability to sustain military spending, Moscow would be forced to scale back its war effort, which would hand Ukraine a strategic victory, even if not a total one. Conversely, if the Russian economy remains stable and continues to fund the war machine, the eventual settlement is likely to be far more favorable to Moscow. Which side is closer to reaching its breaking point? To answer that, we need to look at both economies, starting with Ukraine. Ukraine's survival since 2022 has depended heavily on outside support. When Russia invaded, the Ukrainian economy collapsed. GDP shrank by nearly 29% in 2022, a staggering blow by any measure. Recovery since then has been slow and uneven. Growth of 5.3% in 2023, 2.9% in 2024, and forecasts of between 3 and 5% for 2025. Even so, the overall economy remains about 1/5 smaller than before the war. The demographic losses have been even more severe. Out of a pre-war population of 42 million, Ukraine has lost around 13 million by 2025. 8 million have fled abroad as refugees, while about 5 million are in Russian-occupied territories, most of whom have already been granted Russian citizenship. That demographic shrinkage means fewer workers, fewer entrepreneurs, and a smaller tax base, further straining the economy. The damage from Russian strikes has been relentless. Thousands of missiles and drones have smashed into power plants, bridges, factories, and cities. Yet Ukraine has endured, thanks to extraordinary financial support from abroad. By mid-2025, Ukraine has received about $118 billion in direct aid and loans from its partners. Without that, the economy would likely have collapsed under the weight of war. According to Ukraine's own Center for Economic Strategy, every single hryvnia of domestic state revenue is consumed by defense spending. Civilian government expenses, public sector wages, pensions, and social services are funded almost entirely by foreign donors. In 2024 alone, the budget required $38 billion in external financing. Programs like the US and EU's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration mechanism even channel profits from frozen Russian assets into loans for Ukraine, meaning that, ironically, Russia itself is indirectly paying for the salaries of Ukrainian civil servants. But this arrangement is precarious. The reliance on foreign funds exposes Ukraine to political risks. In Washington, support for Ukraine has become increasingly contested. While in Europe, economic and political pressures are also mounting. Aid comes with conditions, as Ukraine discovered during negotiations over a resource agreement with Washington, which highlighted just how much leverage its backers hold. And although Ukraine's central bank has admirably resisted the temptation to print money since 2023, inflation has remained high, ranging from 14% to 27%, while public borrowing has grown increasingly unsustainable. The government defaulted multiple times, most recently imposing a debt moratorium in August 2024. Credit downgrades have followed, and raising new funds on favorable terms is becoming harder. The manpower situation is even more dire. In 2025, Ukraine attempted to add 250,000 new recruits, but nearly half of them, about 20,000, have been officially listed as deserters. Even with money and weapons, the lack of soldiers could force Ukraine to take the politically explosive step of drafting 18 to 25-year-olds, a group that has so far been exempt. This looming shortage of manpower could prove as decisive as financial challenges. So Ukraine's economy, while resilient and resourceful, is stretched to the breaking point and sustained almost entirely by foreign support. Which brings us to Russia. The early months of the war were brutal for Moscow's economy. When Western sanctions first hit in 2022, the ruble's value collapsed, hundreds of foreign companies pulled out, and supply chains were shattered. Inflation surged. The mobilization in September 2022 triggered an exodus of nearly 1 million skilled workers, worsening labor shortages. For a time, it seemed as though the predictions of collapse might come true, but Russia adapted. The government imposed strict capital controls to halt capital flight, redirected trade away from the West toward China, India, and the global South, and rapidly transformed the economy into a war machine. GDP fell only 2.1% in 2022, before rebounding, with growth of 4.1% in both 2023 and 2024. Wages, too, grew substantially, rising by nearly 10% in 2024 alone. Supermarkets remained stocked, even with Western-branded goods smuggled in through third countries, albeit at higher prices. Oil and gas exports continued to flow, often rerouted through intermediaries. Internally, the war economy generated hundreds of thousands of new jobs in the defense sector, with wages double the national average. For many poorer regions, this meant rising living standards, even as it fueled inflation. To counter overheating, Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabulina raised interest rates as high as 21%, slowing inflation to around 10%. On paper, Russia looked remarkably resilient, able to sustain massive war spending while keeping the economy growing. But by 2025, the limits of this model are becoming visible. Both Nabulina and Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov have warned that growth is running out of steam. Many of the free resources that kept the economy humming, unused capacity, labor shifts, redirection of trade have now been exhausted. Forecasts suggest GDP growth will slow to 1.4% in 2025 and turn negative in 2026. That wouldn't necessarily be catastrophic. Many Western economies have endured recessions without collapsing, but Russia faces unique vulnerabilities. One is the banking sector. Years of artificial support, capital controls, state-directed lending, and regulatory leniency are now colliding with rising levels of bad debt. Russians have borrowed heavily to cope with inflation, but at punishingly high interest rates. By early 2025, overdue household loans reached over 10%, and overdue business loans about 4%, with the real numbers likely higher. Banks are being squeezed by plunging profits, falling loan demand, and eroding capital buffers. At least 3 of Russia's largest banks are reportedly in quiet talks with the central bank about bailouts. A single major collapse could trigger a wider financial crisis. Sanctions, too, are biting harder. Russia's strategy of replacing Western markets with non-Western partners has worked to a degree, but at higher costs and inefficiencies. Components imported through back channels can cost 10 times the usual price. Heavy reliance on China and on shadow fleets of oil tankers create strategic vulnerabilities. Most damagingly, the hydrocarbon sector, responsible for 40% of state revenue, is under unprecedented strain. Falling oil prices combined with a strong ruble have cut revenues sharply. Every $10 drop in oil prices costs Russia $17 billion, nearly 1% of GDP. The government's budget deficit for 2025 is now expected at 1.7% of GDP, more than triple earlier projections. To fill the gap, the Kremlin has drawn down its sovereign wealth fund, which now holds less than $50 billion in liquid assets, barely enough to cover 1 year of deficits at current spending levels. After that, Moscow will face hard choices: print money and risk runaway inflation, impose austerity in the middle of a war, or borrow externally. Its debt-to-GDP ratio remains low, around 20%, but options for borrowing are limited outside of BRICS institutions, which lack the scale to provide major support. Meanwhile, Ukraine has found a way to add further strain: drone strikes on Russian refineries. In just the first days of August 2025, multiple major refineries were hit, including Rosneft's facilities in Samara and Ryazan, as well as the Afipsky refinery in Krasnodar. These strikes not only cut export capacity, but also disrupted domestic supplies, forcing Russia to ban most gasoline exports to keep domestic prices under control. Fuel costs have spiked near record levels, placing Putin in a bind: prioritize wartime revenues or domestic stability. For now, he has chosen to protect consumers, but at the expense of export earnings, a trade-off that cannot last indefinitely. Taken together, these pressures show both sides are staggering under the weight of prolonged war. Ukraine is propped up almost entirely by external aid, its demographics gutted and its finances increasingly fragile. Russia has defied early predictions of collapse but is now hitting structural limits, with its banking sector, hydrocarbon revenues, and sovereign reserves all showing cracks. The next months may prove decisive. It would be premature to say that either side is about to collapse, but both are moving closer to that edge, with forces beyond their control pushing them further along. Time, as always, will decide who breaks first. And whatever happens, this story isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. It's about how modern wars are fought not just with soldiers and tanks, but with sanctions, aid packages, supply chains, and financial markets. On the battlefield, in the skies above energy facilities, and in the balance sheets of central banks. The struggle for the future of Ukraine, and perhaps the shape of the global order itself, is playing out in real time.